Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, good evening, whatever time zone you are on. Welcome to the panel on contingency and academic freedom, this roundtable, which is organized by the Academic Freedom Committee of the International Studies Association. And the purpose actually of this panel is trying to address different aspects of a growing problem in academia. In fact, some people have argued it has become a structural problem of the growing number of contingent faculty and the implication that this development has on academic freedom in all its aspects. I'm delighted to see that we have a great number, great group of colleagues to discuss this issue. Tony Lang, Charlotte Q, Mark Gibney, and myself will be addressing this issue. And each speaker has about 10 to 12 minutes. And then we are going to open the floor for discussion. So without further ado, thank you again to my fellow panelists, to all those of you who are joining us for this session. And Tony, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, George, and thank you for putting this together. And I know you're on the committee now, the Academic Freedom Committee, which I've been on, Mark's been on, Charlotte, and so I think it's a really important committee for ISA, and it does such great work. And it's good to see that the previous chair is now going to be the president of ISA, so that's also a good sign, I think. So. I'm going to just, obviously there's no paper here because it's a roundtable discussion, and I'm just going to pose some issues. Over the last couple of years, I've been working with a colleague, Dr. David Miles, here in St. Andrews, and we've been working on the relationship between academic freedom and freedom of speech. So I'm going to just introduce that project that we've been working on, but then I'm going to link it to the kind of contingency problem that's the theme of the panel, or what we would call in the UK academic precarity, because I think there are some important overlaps here and some interesting ways to think about it. So I'm a theorist, so I don't unfortunately have a presentation for you. I hope that at least some of the reflections I can give might be helpful. So I'm just going to talk through a couple ideas. So just briefly, the paper that we're developing, that we're going to be submitting to a journal in the not too distant future, is the basic question is, has contemporary liberalism changed or undermined the idea of academic freedom? And our hypothesis is that yes, it has. And what we mean by those two terms, so what liberalism is for us in this project is a combination of neoliberal political economy and the kind of more traditional free speech idea that comes from liberalism. Whereas academic freedom, as we all know, I don't think we need to give a definition. There's multiple definitions out there, but it's the ability of scholars to research and teach on matters related to their area of expertise. And one of the things that we do in this paper is we focus on the idea of authority. So our focus is that there are authority structures in place, both within the university and more widely within society, that structure and kind of frame the way what both academic freedom is and broadly what liberalism is as well. So I don't want to go too much into the details of our paper, but I'll just say that in the paper itself, we introduce this distinction between practical and theoretical authority. Practical authority in political philosophy is the idea of you are in authority because through some procedure. So you're put into a position of authority due to some procedure. Theoretical authority is that you are an authority, that is, you're an authority because you have some body of knowledge. So those are the two traditionally, those are the two conceptions of authority that operate. Even though we're talking about academics, we don't focus as much on theoretical authority. We're interested in practical authority. So what does it mean to be in authority when it comes to a university or a discipline or a society? And how does that relate to the question of academic freedom? So that's what we try to think about. And one of the ways we try to get at this is by looking at the values that justify how you get to be in authority. And we identify 4 values for it, what are sometimes called authoritative values. And those are obviously freedom, it's a key one, truth, which is the other second, obviously for the university. What we then call productivity, And then the fourth is professionalism. So these four values, we argue, underlie the kind of authority structures that are relevant for academic freedom. And briefly, we all kind of know what freedom and liberty are. Those are basic ideas, of course, and I don't want to go into those. Truth is a more complicated one. I'm not going to try to define truth, but I think we all have a general sense of what the pursuit of truth is. That's what we as scholars are seeking to do. Productivity is the more maybe complicated one. So productivity is comes from political economy, and it's the idea that derives from neoliberalism that our work should somehow have a direct impact in changing and create and improving society, and that we are governed by those kinds of categories, those kind of values of we are part of a capitalist political economy, etc. And then professionalism is not the same as the pursuit of truth, but it's what we do as scholars. We have a professional community that is everything from peer review, professional journals, book reviews, our own conduct in the classroom, our conduct as researchers. Those are what we call the values of professionalism, what it means to be a professional academic. So those are the kind of categories those are the values we think are most interesting to look at. And then in our case, we link the academic life to the values of truth and professionalism, and the wider social liberal, neoliberal context to the values of liberty and productivity. So we try to talk about these, and the basic argument of our paper is that the two values of freedom and productivity are overwhelming, that is undermining the values of truth and professionalism. So that's the kind of payoff of our paper. That's what we're arguing. We look at this in different ways. And so one of the ways we do it, we look at it. There's recently been in the UK in February 2021, there was a white paper published. And for those of you who don't know, a white paper is a document that's introduced before legislation is introduced into Parliament. It's kind of a consultative document. So there was actually a white paper put forward called Higher Education, Free Speech and Academic Freedom. Nicely timed for our purposes here, but it comes largely out of conservative. The government here in the UK is very conservative right now. Comes out of two kinds of sets of conservative concerns. One is about conservative academics not supposedly having their voices heard on campuses, and also some kind of questions some feminists who are concerned about their voices not being heard around gender issues. Also, the report is very critical of the cancel culture. That's the larger kind of underlying issue that is animating this government's approach. So that's what's going on here in the UK. We use that white paper to think a little bit about this. I'm just going to say, so that's the paper, that's the white paper, and I only have about 3 or 4 minutes left here. So I want to just talk about how these things relate to this issue of precarity, which is not something that we're writing about in our paper, but actually when I had to think about preparing this, it actually might shape and change our paper, because the precarious status of academics, that is those who are non-tenured, et cetera, is a real problem. Now, just for clarification purposes, in the UK, any academic that's hired into a full-time position has tenure. So tenure doesn't operate the same way in the United Kingdom as it does in the US or North American context. Nevertheless, there is, as in many places around the world, there's a lot of hiring of people on very part-time contracts. And we do this ourselves. And at my university, I was head of department, and I know I did this as well. And you're forced to do it. Forced is maybe not the right word, but so it's a real issue here in the United Kingdom, the precarious status of a lot of our colleagues. And so, how does this relate to academic? So, you would think academic freedom would protect precarious academics in their ability to do their own research or their own scholarship or be able to teach, even if they don't have full-time positions. I don't think that's the case, unfortunately, and that's partly because of this argument that we're making. I think these values of, let's say, productivity, that is the capitalist political economy, is much stronger here in the UK university sector than the pursuit of truth or the defense of freedom and liberty for our colleagues. And what do I mean by that? I'll just give you a couple quick examples. In the United Kingdom, we have something called the Research Excellence Framework, which is a government-led initiative that evaluates the research by all scholars throughout the country, and it evaluates us by units, that is by departments. But one of the important parts of that has become the impact agenda, as it's called. And the impact agenda is about just what it sounds like. What is the impact you're having on society? And that impact, while it can be social, political, economic, tends to fall back onto the economic, in my experience. So every 7 years, we have to issue this, there's this overall exercise that's done, and impact has become one of the most important agendas. It's increased in the percentage of what it counts for. And in my view, this disables those who don't have full-time positions, and I'm not just talking about politics and international relations, but in lots of different fields. It disables the ability of a non-full-time academic member of staff to even think about that, to think about what their impact might be. And this value has become way too important, in my view, as opposed to allowing staff members to pursue truth or to defend their freedom to take on topics that they may wish to pursue. I'd also say, unfortunately, the professionalism of our own disciplines, I should say, because international studies is a very wide-ranging discipline, lots of different people coming from lots of different fields. But I would also say that certainly in the UK, there's an expectation that when you're hired for a new position, you have more than one publication. And you know, I didn't have any publications when I got hired for my job, and I went to a good university, got my PhD from a good place. So the expectation here in the United Kingdom, and this could be a British problem, I don't know if it's in the United States, but the assumption that you'd have time to not only complete a PhD, but to publish multiple papers, even a book, in order to get a position, strikes me as highly problematic for young people today. So I think those kinds of values are becoming more prominent. Is there any way in which the values of truth or liberty can come forward and protect precarious academics? I don't know. I would hope so. But I think we have to be cautious in saying that academic freedom is, in general, one way to protect our colleagues. That's my timer going on. So there we go. All right. So I'm done. Thank you, George.
Okay. Thank you, Tony. Charlotte, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you, George, and nice to see you, Tony and Mark. This is an issue that I've not really thought about before. George invited me to join this panel, so I appreciate the opportunity to sort of think about it and learn a bit more about the issues. My own contribution here may focus more on the law school context, which is the one I am most familiar with, and it may differ from other kind of perspectives with regard to contingent faculty, particularly in undergraduate settings. I have myself over time taught as what we call adjunct faculty. And I presently work with a team of adjunct instructors on a program for students who are interested in pursuing public policy. So for these reasons, I've also had a little bit of reason to think about the place and role of these individuals in teaching, less so in academic freedom, but since the panel was on that, I have tried to think about that. The first thing I would say is I think the issue is complicated because when one thinks about contingent faculty, I realize that there are a lot of different kinds of individuals involved. And the issue of academic freedom, their status, how they fit into the teaching and learning community in general, I think may differ. So there are often in law schools and probably elsewhere as well, senior practitioners who are tapped to teach in some form of practical training. In law schools, we have clinics that require supervision by licensed attorneys, or in the case of my policy program, individuals who actually are legally trained but working in policy environments. And so they're tapped to teach in a practical way to students. This was my own experience. So these individuals actually come into their assignments without any expectation of tenure, longer-term hiring, or indeed publishing. They are there to make a contribution to society, in some ways to advance the profession, and so I think may see some of these issues in a different way. Having said that, it seems that they have important roles to play in governance to some extent, certainly setting of curricular goals within a teaching environment, and of course relationships with students. So these go towards sort of the professionalism category that Tony highlighted as a value, and I think that's important. So they have a contribution to make, but the research area may not be quite where this group would be pursuing, and I think would come in without that expectation. Either way, the institution would not expect research from them, and they don't expect to do research themselves. You then have the category of graduate students. These, again, I think within this, there's a huge range. There are those who are teaching to learn how to teach. There are those who are teaching because they have to in order to meet requirements of their fellowships and other things, and sometimes teach more than is beneficial to pursuit of their own research for a variety of reasons. I think this group is most vulnerable with regard to thinking about academic freedom, even within the broad frame of just working within professional standards and productivity in the research area, because there they are constrained not only by the broad strictures of whatever demands may be placed on them in teaching, but they may further have to be very mindful of the views and approaches of their advisors, their departments, the university, and so forth. So there are a lot of dynamics that affect these individuals that put them in a, I think, particularly vulnerable state with regard to either asserting their own voices, their research, their understandings. They're very much at the mercy of those above them in the hierarchy. Having said that, I will say there are some great teaching that comes out of graduate students, and they work with teams of tenured faculty. So I think, again, structure makes a difference. I just recently served on an awards committee for the university for graduate teaching, and there are some really creative things that occur. But there you have active involvement by tenured faculty who are nurturing these individuals, who value the contributions of these students into the teaching. They're fully part of an instructional team. So they have a voice in, I think, setting student learning outcomes, understanding, their place in the curriculum, things of this nature. So I think having that ability makes a difference. And then there's a third category of individuals that are kind of a mixed group. There are individuals who are in campus communities, such as the one I came from prior to moving to Texas in Champaign-Urbana in Illinois, so basically a university town. And there you have people who are accompanying spouses, significant others, and so forth, who are doing research at the university, but they themselves may not have opportunities that necessarily fit their particular backgrounds. And so teaching may be a way to earn some money, fill the time, and do some professional work. But again, these individuals may or may not have research interests, but are not in a position to very strongly, I think, assert many rights, even rights within the classroom. There are those who take on contingent work as a way of perhaps breaking into the academy, who may come from somewhat different academic backgrounds or from outside of the United States, say, and are trying to get into the teaching market, and so would choose this as a way to sort of get acquainted with the community. Again, probably not a group of individuals who are in a very strong position to assert much. And then finally, you have a group who just like to hang around university towns and stay, and so are there for lifestyle reasons and may have less interest, particularly in research, but just sort of have something to make a living. The last two categories, I think, are the ones that probably are the greatest danger of being denied academic due process and professional advancement. But again, I think it would be interesting to understand really what their expectations might be. On the other hand, failing to integrate all kinds of contingent faculty into the wider curricular discussions can be harmful in terms of coherence within a curriculum, adherence to common standards. Universities now, of course, you need to have training in technology, diversity, all kinds of different standards. accessibility to students, these may all suffer unless these individuals are fully integrated into the teaching community. And sometimes by not having them, the contingent faculty in a place where they actually can engage with tenured faculty, you lose the benefit of the teaching experience that they may have. And some very creative things oftentimes occur. So one does not even benefit from the enrichment that might occur from learning about the classroom experiences of these individuals. So how do I think might we improve this situation? It seems to me the key is to find ways to connect with the tenured faculty, particularly where tenured faculty have a strong voice in governance. So in law schools, because we are perhaps smaller communities, we do generally have fairly active faculty governance. And so there is a faculty committee that oversees our clinical faculty, our adjunct faculty, and these serve as an advocate for these individuals who are in that group. Having said that, there's still gaps, and so this is not a perfect situation. I think inviting more of the contingent faculty, particularly who have had experience into discussions of curricular design and learning outcomes, which are, I think becoming regular items of conversation now at universities, also would be useful. Perhaps some discussion of expectations to begin with would be helpful in terms of faculty coming in. Are they expecting to publish? What really are their interests apart from teaching a class, and where might they engage with faculty resources that might be available more widely, either for teaching or for research, or indeed even for practice. So I think numbers matter. Keeping an eye on the percentage ratio of contingent faculty to permanent faculty. How much do they teach? In our case, often adjunct faculty teach very small classes. Indeed, that's why we have them. We're limited to perhaps 8 in a clinic to be overseen and mentored by a practitioner. So again, I think the purpose of why we have faculty who are other than tenured should be looked at, and that may make a difference with regard to some of the issues that we're considering. How long can individuals stay in these positions without some further conversation? I think probably some time. So setting some markers that allow management of this to invite faculty understanding of who else is in the teaching community, what they are doing, why they're doing it, and so forth. Maybe, these are some of the tripwires that can assist in understanding exactly the implications for institutions and students, but also at some level for the individuals who are serving in these roles. So it seems to me that the greatest threat to academic freedom by having faculty who may be other than on the tenure track or are tenurable is potential volatility that you create by having an over-reliance on a group whose motivations, indeed, maybe their thinking with regard to how to do something, the content and so forth, are these things kept up to date and the like. You don't have the usual sorts of professional community within which to either engage them or enrich them, and for that matter, benefit from their experience. So I think the uncertainty you create by having a group that is sort of functioning offline is not beneficial to the academic enterprise, and academic freedom would be amongst the issues there. So those are just a few reflections that I can contribute to this discussion right now, but I'm eager to hear more from others. Thanks, George.
Thank you, Charlotte. Mark, are you able to join?
I don't know. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Well, let me say a few words. One is that I couldn't hear much of what happened before me because I had this on some other speakers series. I mean, I when people have asked me how it's been like to teach in the pandemic, I said, once I get the technology down, I've actually found it fairly easy. The hardest part for me has been the technology. I panic immediately. I just start hitting every button imaginable, and I had actually set it up at my home computer, but then I thought, well, I'm not sure. So I went to my office. I guess I hadn't set it up in advance. And then the panic hits about 9:20 this morning, and it's existed until a few minutes ago when I know you can hear me. So thank you so much, and it's nice. I would ask all of you to repeat what you said, but let me just pick up because I could hear Charlotte at the very end, and I think I'm going to present. I thought she was a little bit too optimistic. I thought she was thinking. I see this as sort of class warfare myself. And I think it's a delicious irony here that it's for tenured professors who's talking about contingency faculty. You may have a much different conversation if you had 4 contingent faculty who've been in that position for many, many years, who are speaking about that. So in a way, I think we have a preferred position. And I agree with Charlotte. It'd be nice if the tenured faculty attended to the adjuncts, but I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure they have an interest in doing so. They seem to have their preferred position. The university may be trying to encourage them to retire, which is the kind of thing that I think maybe at least I'm facing. I get not overtly, but just these little notices that if I retire, I could be the Virgin Islands as I get this, and I wouldn't have to do any more letters of recommendation. So, I mean, some of the stuff I have done on this thing, I must confess, I had not thought of this, which may until a few years ago, and this may be an indication, and I think it was sort of discussions I had with George, and I do think that he came up with this term, this adjunctification of higher education. I had no idea it was this bad. I mean, let me just say that. I mean, I'm on my own campus. There has been a concerted effort to reduce and perhaps eliminate altogether, which I don't think they have done, but at least they have given the lip service to that, because I think they think that they would like to have a faculty that is permanent. But what surprised me were a couple things. I mean, you always heard these horror stories, right? And they always seem to be anecdotal. But there was the best data that I could find is this House committee in 2014, and maybe a little bit more recently with the Chronicle of Higher Education. But it was the levels of this, the levels of how much and again, it wasn't just the United States, which is the context that I work in. This seemed to be universal, seemed to be Western democracies quite generally. And I heard a little bit from Tony about sort of maybe the different situation in the UK, but it does seem to be universal. And what I think is universal is underpay. All right, I don't think any adjuncts are commanding large salaries by any stretch of the imagination. Overworked, the number of adjunct faculty who are piecing together different courses. Was also, I think, we have been sold this bill of goods that it's something that maybe people do early in their careers and then they move on to other things. And it seemed, again, from the data from this 2014 study was that anything but. I mean, people were staying in this situation. And again, some may be voluntarily, but if you look at the pay and how many are teaching at how many different institutions, it's hard to imagine that many people would want to be in that. And there was this Chronicle of Higher Education that mentioned 75% in the United States now, that 75% of the faculty were without the prospect of permanent employment. And that was sort of eye-opening. I mean, 75% of the faculty now teaching in higher education do not face the prospect, and again, it's just a prospect, but face the prospect of permanent employment. So I think all of us, this is an academic freedom committee sponsored talk, but I'm wondering if we're asking the wrong question, or at least if we're making the question too narrow. And what I'm suggesting is that this to my mind goes far beyond academic freedom. I think one of the concerns we have on this committee, because of our interest in academic freedom, is the consequences of this. You're not going to stick your head up. You're at the will of the university. So all these things that tenured professors enjoy, I think what we're imagining, and I think rightly so, is that adjunct professors are not going to get involved in things that are kind of controversial. There'll be a lot of self-censorship for sure. But to my mind, this may be balkanizing the problem. And again, I don't know what you do. To my mind, there's a much more systematic problem at work here than just academic freedom. I think academic freedom is a very small part of this. And I think that what this should call for is some kind of rethinking of the entire profession, really. I mean, I think it's the entire profession, the way it's structured. And again, I don't mean to take us too far afield, but at my own university, which is only 3,200 students, when I came here in 1998, there were just a handful of administrators. Now we have this, and the number of students has stayed the same. And this is a nice study here of this bureaucratization of the university. Same number of students, almost exactly, and yet we now have more vice chancellors and vice deans and associate provosts and stuff like that. So I mean, I would at some point think that this is the kind of stuff that has to be looked at. I was hoping that the stimulus package in the United States, or even the debt forgiveness, might serve as the vehicle to ask, why do students have so much debt? Where's all this money going to? And yet it doesn't seem to be. It's sort of like, well, how much of the debt will we pay? Will the federal government pay? So in other words, I don't think these larger questions are being asked. I don't think the student debt question is being tied in with the adjunctification of the faculty, which is then separated from academic freedom, right? And so you have all these kind of segments of what I think is a larger problem. And I'm not seeing a larger problem. So in event, these are sort of some of the comments that I thought I'd try to bring here, and I'm just very pleased I was able to bring a little bit here. So let me sign off and then turn it over to George.
Okay, thank you, Mark. In my brief comments, I would like to make the case that academic freedom should be viewed as a human right, and what will be the implications of this. And let me start by saying that my entry point here is a notion that was first developed in Henry Shew's classic work, Basic Rights. I'm sure that all my fellow panelists are familiar with this work. Basically, he defines rights as providing the rational basis for a justified demand that the actual enjoyment of the substance of these rights be socially guaranteed against standard threats. And I want to focus on that. There are two aspects of this conceptualization that I think can be useful in the conversation. First of all, the emphasis on actual enjoyment means that we need to emphasize the important distinction between merely having a right and actually enjoying a right. And this is pertinent in the context of not only the growing legalization of the rights regimes in different countries, but the fact that despite this growing legalization, we see that more and more laws and administrative degrees are hardly realized in practice. This is why the distinction between having a right, which was in the statute book, and enjoying it is such an important distinction. And to realize, to transition from the former to the latter, the role of institutions is critical. In a sense, when you bring in any conversation rights, we are talking about a notion of realizing something that can only be realized through some kind of an institutional development. Rights are institutionally referential. And this is where, of course, the role of academic institutions comes in. The second, of course, thing is that, institutions are supposed to be designed through these lenses to protect the rights holders against deprivation from challenges that are posed by standard threats. Now, of course, the notion of standard threats refers to the most common and issue potential interferences that can reasonably be expected to arise in the normal course of social life. I would argue, for example, if you go out and you expect that you are not going to be mugged, you are not going to be assaulted, and so on and so forth. In the context of an academic environment, I would say that standard threats, protecting from standard threats, means protecting from something that has become structurally embedded in academic life and undermines both the physical and economic security of the members of an academic institution. So I would say that, and let me remind you that, and of course my remarks are focused from the experience of the US, because although I have taught in other universities, most of my academic life has spent in the United States, and the figures that I have looked at are from the US, though I intend to expand my study and do more cross-national comparison of that. But let me remind you, when we go, every discussion on the US starts with the 1915 Declaration that was issued by the American Association of University Professors. And the purpose of that was to have the reasonable security of tenure that would render the profession more attractive to men of high ability and strong personality. Of course, remember, here we're talking about 1915, so only men of high ability and strong personality were considered as being part of the profession. However, the 1940 statement of principles that developed further, built on the 1915, it has an interesting reference. The tenure is a means to certain ends, specifically freedom of teaching and research, and a sufficient degree of economic security to make the profession attractive to men and women of ability. Freedom and economic security, hence tenure, are indispensable to the success of an institution in fulfilling its obligations to the students and society. And I think this is the key issue here. Mark mentioned a study, the 1914 study by this Democratic Staff Committee, which of course has been updated with some subsequent data. Now it is true that it is closed when in for example, 70, the AAUP adopted the interpretive comments that were attached to the 1940 Statement of Principles. About 3/4 of all faculty appointments were tenure line, and 78% of all faculty were full-time. Now, switch to 2015, which is the period that ends the examination of that report that Mark mentions. And you have a very different situation. Contingent faculty constitute 55% in 1975, and tenure-like faculty constituted 45% of the academic labor force. By 2015, this had risen to 70%, and the tenure faculty have been reduced to 30%. Now it has gone close to 75 versus 25. And of course, it is obvious that in this kind of situations, when, for example, faculty are hired to do piecework, they have no guarantee that they will last longer than the semester for which they have been hired. It is true there are some universities that have gone a step further, that they say if you serve as a contingent faculty for a certain period of time, you are entitled to have longer contracts, like 3-year contracts, as it is the case in my university, to be renewable. But of course, this is only for a small percentage of faculty that has taught for a certain period of time in the university. Most adjunct, most contingent faculty go still semester by semester. So it is kind of difficult when you have people that are hired to do piecework and they have no guarantee that they will last longer than a semester. How can you expect, of course, to have a presence and a voice in governance bodies and processes that are designed to ensure their participation in decision making, let alone the ability to to engage in voicing opinions that may be considered controversial or unorthodox, both inside the classroom as well as outside the classroom, when the main criteria that will determine their continuation in the institution is whether the students are happy in the classroom. And here, of course, I should add another problem that has not been raised, and that generates a lot of should generate a lot of concern among us. The fact that in addition to the issues that were addressed by my other colleagues about the growing bureaucratization of the university, for example, Mark mentioned how fewer administration positions there is university when he joins, and now you have a vice president, a dean, a vice dean for every conceivable activity in the college, and they expect the faculty to do continuous assessment reports with everything on anything that they can think about, even if it does not serve the function of the academic institution, simply in order to justify their appointment. But another problem, of course, that I think adds to the precarity or the changing, and I agree we need to take a broader look at how academic governance and the priorities are structures, is also the fact that increasingly the students are expected to be treated as consumers in the university as opposed to individuals that are supposed to learn. One of the reasons that I find deeply irritating the forms that I receive every year, every semester for my evaluation, is that you see that students are being asked questions like, are you happy in the classroom? Does the professor actually respond promptly to your inquiry? Is the learning environment comfortable? Well, maybe someone say we're getting, maybe of an older generation, but I think that the purpose in the university is not to make students happy. It is make students to make sure that they are subjected to certain rigorous training and that they learn these things, even if that makes them unhappy, provided, of course, that unhappiness does not result from any cruel behavior on the part of the instructor. But this kind of mentality also does not help, and it fits with the concerns about the adjuncts, because, and I discuss a lot with our adjuncts colleagues, they are terrified about the students' evaluations, because if the students' evaluations do not say that I'm happy in the classroom, I'm maybe exaggerating a little bit, but not by much here, they are going to be in trouble. Anyhow, so it is. So I would like to, there is more that I would like to say, but I would like to conclude with saying that by viewing academic freedom as a human right and addressing this as a standard threat that we need to address, it sensitizes to a need to adopt a more holistic approach. And if it is unaddressed, this issue of the standard threat, it would undermine both the commitment to disciplinary competence, which is a core concern for more restrictive conceptions, and the ability to contribute to the maximum of one's ability, knowledge, and skills to the common good. Going forward, I would like to highlight two things, and then I will stop. First, that a contingency, whether we like it or not, is here to stay. So any further work on how to address the challenges of the academic leaders must be premised on the reality of a majority contingent academy. So any strategies and tactics that we may want to think about how to address this issue must be premised on the idea that this is the new landscape of the American universities, not a transient phenomenon. And I'm sure if a study comes out, another one, and the data are more updated, the latest data on the percentages that I have is from 2016. I am sure if there is a latest study will show, if anything, that the numbers are growing on the contingent faculty and they are shrinking on the tenure track faculty. The second I think it is also important, especially now that because of the pandemic that we have moved online, is to examine how, and of course in the new normal, it will be interesting to see how much of this shift to online education will continue. I suspect that it is here to stay and will grow. To see to what extent academic developments are accentuating this trend. What comes here foremost to my mind is the proliferation of online education programs, which routinely operate on an almost franchise-like model of prefabricated syllabi and content delivering faculty, which are ideally suited for piecework, okay, carried out by contingent faculty. I think one of the things that we need to address going forward is the relation between the introduction and expansion of online programs and the hiring of contingent faculty to teach in them. The expansion of online programs is just part and parcel, I would argue, of the bigger move towards the corporatization of academic institutions and the concomitant demands for efficiency, flexibility in all aspects of academic work, customer service orientation, and incessant learning outcomes assessment. And I'll stop here. And before we open the floor for discussion, I wanted to know if any of my fellow panelists have any additional comments or thoughts on what has been presented before we open the floor for discussion. Yes, Charlotte.
So, George and Mark, I agree with you completely about looking at this more holistically on the matter of administrators. Indeed, every accreditation standard seems to have its own dedicated administrative team that is set out to do something or other with titles that are indistinguishable from one another. At my university, this is a huge enterprise, and Texas is not a place you would expect a lot of regulation, but indeed in the academic sphere, it's extraordinary how many standards and assessments and the like. So this is part of it in some sense of trying to develop accountability. One has created this bureaucracy, which makes it more and more difficult actually to spend time on what you should be focusing on. And you find yourself very much trying to adapt to whatever the standards are and making it easy to meet those standards that you are asked to comply with. This in itself, I think, has an insidious effect on how you teach and the like. And I will add, I think the technology has not necessarily helped in this respect. I think the pandemic experience tells us some things that are beneficial about engaging with students in the online environment, but these teaching platforms are extraordinarily controlling and also force you to deliver yourself in a particular manner. These systems are in place and will stay. We have syllabuses that have to comply with a particular format, with all kinds of language that go on it. They have to be presented in a particular format. They have to be delivered in a particular format. So if these things are university-wide, they are only that much worse for those who actually have no voice in even saying, what does this make sense? Is this helping in any way advancing the academic enterprise, whether that's teaching or research? And so this, it is, I think, a holistic problem. Structurally, we're moving into places that are more and more constraining ourselves at the same time that the requirements for tenure and review of tenure portfolios and all of this are also becoming much more elaborate and intricate. We have indeed at my university an entire process of post-tenure review that is almost as rigorous as tenure itself, which takes enormous time. And so these are also factors that affect, what people are doing. Maybe the place to start is, what are people doing, and are they doing what we believe is should be contributing to the academic enterprise and mindful of values such as the ones you and Tony have just mentioned. So I think holistic, definitely, And in that respect, I don't think we're moving in the right direction. And this is yet another factor that we need to be mindful of. What is a solution? I don't know. You're right, George. These things are here to stay.
Yeah. Thank you, Charlotte. Mark, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, and thank you so much, Charlotte. I mean, that was quite eloquent. But I think what I would challenge both of you on is whether this is permanent. I mean, it certainly seems to be, right? It certainly seems to be. The numbers here are astounding. But I'm wondering if, for example, if you know, in the United States, the U.S. News and World Report, and these rankings and all this other kind of stuff, if you could have things like this ranked, in other words, if this was part of the ranking, the system, which would be the percentage of the faculty, I think things could change rapidly here. But there's a vested interest that the university has, I think, to move in that direction. But I guess I'm saying I'm just not convinced that you can't stem the tide here. I think you have to hit the universities where it hurts the most, and it could be that if their ranking goes down because they have a certain percentage of the faculty that is not permanent. In other words, if that was one of the negatives here, and I think it should be one of the negatives here, that's the kind of thing that could be turned around quite rapidly, because again, I think George is right. I think the students are consumers, but in a way, the consumer here looks at rankings, and if the rankings could reflect this kind of thing, I think you may see a rapid change. That's all. But I'm not so sure what they do. Every university seems to, they seem to hide the true, to my mind, the true student-teacher ratio. They make it seem as if, and in the UNC system, we're nothing compared to Chapel Hill. But Chapel Hill will advertise having very small classes, but the kids we have who transfer from there, classes of 300 students, kind of stuff. But somehow they include the graduate seminars, they include other kinds of stuff to make it look much more appealing. And one other thing is about the online. I mean, I've taught in person from the beginning of the pandemic. I've been in person, and I think it goes better on Zoom because everyone's got a mask on in class. They got a quarter of the class that is online, 3/4 are present. I think we would be much better off just going to Zoom 100%. Students will not hear it. They will not. They want to be in person, even though I can't hear what the hell they're saying. They can hear me, but I can't hear what they're saying with the muffled things. And yet it's like at the end of every period as they walk out, thank you. It's like instead of leaving an apple on my desk, they're saying thank you. I've never been thanked in 36 years. I've never been thanked once. And now I'm being thanked at the end of every period. The kids want this. And so in some ways, maybe we're moving towards online, but I say to the administration where I'm teaching, we need to make this a bigger deal. That of all the schools in the UNC system, I think we're the only one that from the very beginning we stayed in person. This is something to kind of sell because I think students thirst for that in person, right? It may be easier and cheaper for the university to go online, and certainly for some students it's more convenient. But what I've also found from the pandemic is this thirst for in-class classes. And that's it.
Tony, do you have some thoughts before we open the floor? Is there anything you want to say? No?
Just to echo all the things that everybody's been saying, I think it's very interesting. Although I'm not sure I'd go with Mark on the making the Zoom university is not maybe the route. Just because, I mean, obviously there was stuff before this. Online education, of course, a big deal before the pandemic too. And that, I think that is part of the way universities can make money. And that's a concern I have is, of course, universities do have to make money because we want to be employing people fully and with good benefits and all that kind of stuff. But it does, that would be my one concern about that approach. But it also then feeds into what you're saying, George, too, about students being consumers. That's again part of the kind of capitalist political economy that we're living in, and it's not like we could change that ourselves. Nor as I'm saying that's necessarily a bad thing, but I do think there's ways in which the university's values of the pursuit of truth can easily be overwhelmed by the value of making money. And I mean, I think you would agree with that too. So there is a kind of, how we balance that is, I think, the real challenge, and how academic freedom I guess the question I want to pose to everybody, does academic freedom as a principle, because I like what you said, George, it's a human right, but does that help protect us from any of the, or protect our contingent faculty? Does academic freedom as a value really do the work we want it to do? Because my worry is that it's so much part of it's the product of other values that aren't necessarily designed to protect against people being exploited. I wish it was, but I think at times it doesn't do that job. So that would be my question for everybody on the panel, like, or in the audience. I know we get just a couple, but that'd be an interesting question to think about.
Yeah. Before we open the floor for discussion, very quick comments, brief. One for respond to Mark, the other to the question that you raised, Tony. On Mark, I fully agree with you. Well, we may differ. I personally think that this is here to stay, but of course we'll have to wait and see until the next data comes out. But I think my prediction will be to show that it is even getting worse. But I agree with you that this should factor as a criterion in the rankings. Having said that, it is already used when, for example, we go through the middle states accreditation process. When they come, one of the criticism always is you need to have more full-time faculty in the classroom. And this presumably will affect your evaluation. But it does not affect it because although they do highlight it in the report, it is not raised as an issue that, as a red flag issue that may undermine future accreditation process, because what they care, the primacy goes to continuing productivity and to the extent to which students, among other indicators, the students are satisfied with the type of education that are getting in the institution. So is there any chance that this might become one of the red flag criteria for rankings or reaccreditation? I do not think that we're there yet, although it is an issue that is routinely. And another problem there is that when administrators raise the issue of the fact that you need more full people in the classroom, the response of the faculty, and up to a certain extent, rightly so, is what about the productivity? At the same time that we're told be more in the classroom, we have every year the evaluation of our productivity. I don't know about your universities, but in our university, you need to submit a report of publications, conference presentations, everything. And guess what? There is a carrot and a stick attached to us in the form of travel funds for the department. If the department does not deliver a certain output, our travel funds will be cut. So when an administration calls me, and I will speak on a personal grounds here, and says you should be more as a full-time and a very senior faculty member in the classroom, I would say, yes, I would like to be that. But tell me what kind of productivity you expect from me if I do more teaching, because we already have teaching. So you want to highlight productivity for other reasons, for the middle state accreditation, for the reputation of the university. And at the same time, you are asking me to be more in the classroom. This is not possible. There are certain choices here. Either you lower the productivity expectations, in which case I would say I will start looking for another university, because research is for me the most important criterion here. But at least if you want to go that route, you should lower the expectations of productivity. But no, they are putting us in an impossible position. More productivity and more in the classroom. I don't know if you have similar experiences in your university, but this is my experience in my university. And I think that these two clash. Anyhow, let us. I see we have one question here from Christy. I agree with Mark, rethinking of the entire profession. How does the way we teach our graduate students limit their freedom to think about and eventually choose different career paths? What can we do to promote a culture where academic freedom also entails alternative career paths such that we do not exacerbate the contingent faculty crisis? Who would like to take this?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And, one of the things I do, because of course we all find this. I think we do. I'll get students, really super bright students, really curious, interesting, and they say to me, I want to get a PhD and be a professor. I'm like, okay, here's what it means to be a professor in the contemporary world. Here's the kind of work you got to do. Here's what it entails. Because there is a romanticism about the profession, especially from students. They don't understand what we're doing always when we're not in the classroom in front of them. And so I hate to put it this way, but sometimes I think one of the best things we can do to prevent the contingency crisis, and it goes along with Christy's question, is to, maybe discourage some of our students from pursuing PhDs. And I don't mean that to be arrogant in any way, but there is, of course, a glut. And maybe it's my field too, like political theorists, there's not a lot of jobs out there, right? You're not looking, it's not like Charlotte was saying in a law school where there are other obvious career paths. Political theory, you're going to teach. That's about all you can do. So I think that's the challenge for me, at least, is to say, take your really good ideas and go do some other things maybe, and maybe think about PhD, but just recognize here's the steps you're going to have to go through. So, yeah.
Anybody else? Charlotte, Mark? Any comments, thoughts?
No, I'm with Tony. It's hard to do though.
Yeah.
It's one of the more difficult things to do. I have my misgivings. I'm very frank with my students who are thinking of doing that. For many of my students, it's law school or this. And which is a worse option? Is it to be an unhappy lawyer or to be searching for a job? And I must also say, since I do a lot of work outside the United States, in some ways I think the U.S. is almost better. I don't know how many people I know in Europe who are on their whatever number postdoc kind of thing. And I'm thinking, these are people with, books from Cambridge, Oxford, whatever. And they're I'm writing a letter right now for a person who's one of the more brilliant political international lawyers I know, and yet, so I don't know. I think the worst thing is to say that I think you got to be upfront about what it's like. I know they see me and they think, well, geez, this doesn't look that hard. You know what I mean? It doesn't seem that bright. And he,
we know you're bright, Mark. Don't worry.
But I do think you've got to be frank, and I do mean that. And I agree with George. I think the numbers are only going to get worse, right? I think but it can't get much worse than 3/4. Really, you got to have a couple tokens, a couple token professors here, some kind of tenure, some kind of permanence. But again, George and I will differ in terms of whether that tide can ever be turned. But I do think you have to be in some ways brutally honest, and I mean not just give them the data, but just saying, I know all these people who have been searching and they're doing all this kind of postdoc stuff, and it's not a pretty sight. It really isn't, and we all know that.
Yeah, Charlotte, anything you want to say on this?
No,
Okay. Well, I also agree with Tony and Mark on that. I have to say, when I was entering the job market, I would not have liked, and it was a difficult period at that time too. I would not have liked to hear that message from my faculty advisor, but you have to be frank with your students. When a student approaches me and asks if they want to engage in a PhD, I tell them that it involves a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, this kind of process. And at the end of that process, it is very uncertain whether they are going to find a tenure track position. So they should really think of alternative options, probably working in a think tank. In my area of expertise, try to think in terms also of an international organization or non-governmental organization. And some of the bigger and more prestigious now are hiring PhDs when they set up different think tanks, or they do these large studies, large end studies, and so on and so forth, for example, on human rights violations. So there are at least more venues available to graduate students that clearly were when I was finishing my PhD. But having said that, we have to be, one way to combat contingency is really to encourage students to pursue alternative career paths. Although I know that this sometimes is disappointing for some students, but you owe it to the students to give them your frank and advice. I think this is what it is due. If despite these things they are still prepared, and what I always ask them is, you don't only need to have this desire in your mind that you want to be an academic, but you must have it in your guts, not just mind, to have a real passion. I'm prepared to go through hell, because I myself currently experiencing something that Mark said. I have an excellent PhD student with 3 postdocs. We're still trying to get a job. And this is disheartening indeed. Yes, Charlotte.
George, I think it is certainly true to have the discussion about expectations. The conversations I've had with students, even in pursuing legal work, sometimes for international positions and the like, so these are competitive things that may not be readily available. But I think when we speak of alternatives, we may also have some handicap. And that is sort of our own networks and places that we can actually tangibly point students to or facilitate contact with. And, in our own cases, we also may be narrow with regard to how much we can offer beyond saying, well, you should think more broadly. You can even point to organizations, but it's a different matter if you can actually introduce to somebody or say, I have this friend or something like this. Which we can more readily do in the academic environment because that's our own circle, but we may not be so readily able to do in other circles. And so if we could somehow do that, and that's where places like ISA and things like that, maybe our associations, our professional connections can help in this respect, because it's one thing to speak of alternatives in a kind of a theoretical manner. It's another thing to be tangible and actually be able to engage with individuals. And I think that could be a factor.
Yeah,
George, I think there was one question before Christie's, I think, in the.
Okay, so you want to read it, Tony?
Okay, it's from Michelle. I'm curious what each of you would recommend to those of us who are tenured or IT or tenured track and interested in advocating both the insights for the rights of contingent faculty and protecting academic freedom, given the very severe structural constraints of the neoliberal institution, which is not necessarily interested in either of these goals. So yeah, so I'll give a quick answer to that one because I know we don't have too much time left, which is, that is one of the problems of being institutionally constrained. I think Charlotte's suggestion is a really good one, which is to try to make, maybe for our students, PhD students, encourage them to, the places with the connections we know, to encourage them to be hiring people. I think would be really helpful if I heard you correctly, Charlotte, there. The only other thing I thought of on this question is, what can we do as individual scholars? One of the things I try to do is publish with my students, say, let's do a paper together, and let's use your ideas. We'll use some of mine. We'll come up with something, and just, to get those publications out there, because we know that's the coin of the realm so often in getting positions. And that's my one suggestion that I try to do, and I know on the sciences it's different, of course, because they have tons of people working on one project, but so I don't know if anybody else has suggestions for that.
Yeah. Anybody quickly, because we are coming up to the end of the session. Anybody else wants to chime in? Yes, Mark.
Yeah, I do think, I don't know, I don't think the tenure track people have done enough. Again, we're all acting like we're defenseless people. Right, that this is just happening and there's nothing we can do. But my sense is that this is something that most of us have not spoken up about, that this is a problem, right? That this is a problem. Again, because the numbers here have been so overwhelming. But again, since we're already in, it's like immigration. People are already inside. they really don't care that much about people who are on the outside, right? For the most part. And I think it's the same kind of phenomenon here. The people on the inside, they have their tenure track job, they have their tenure, and yet it doesn't seem to be a particularly pressing issue. I think it detracts, to my mind, I mean, there can be some positives here, but to my mind, it detracts from the educational enterprise. But I don't think that people on the inside here have been nearly the voice that they should be.
Mhm. Anybody quickly? Last minute comment? Anybody? Okay, well, the only thing I want to say very quickly, first of all, on Tony what says, I also try to help my students by either presenting on occasions with them at conference or publishing together, and that helps. But also, folks, I think we as tenure faculty, we do have a responsibility when our students are in the job market to go beyond writing just the standard recommendation letter. For example, I remember very fondly one or two of my professors when I was doing my PhD that they would pick up the phone and directly speak to people in the places that I was applying, and that helps. And this is something that I have tried to do with students. So to demonstrate that you are prepared to go to the extra step to help your students in the process. I also want to absolutely endorse what Mark said. I am surprised at how little many colleagues that I know in my university, not all though, but in my university and other universities, do not see the issue of contingency as an issue of academic freedom. And to get more engaged, we need to get more engaged. If we ourselves from the inside, we don't try to do more about it, then we cannot expect other entities and institutions. And this means using our governance structures, the faculty senate, the council of chairs, open fora that the university is organizing periodically, community fora, and so on and so forth, to highlight some of these issues. I have quite a few colleagues in my university that are very vocal on this issue, but we could use more voices. And this is actually a very important thing to bear in mind, because unfortunately, there is a certain percentage of colleagues who, as long as they are doing their publications and their teaching, they are not much concerned about what's happening. So we need to become more community conscious ourselves. And that's where the efforts should start with us. Anyhow, folks, I'm sorry. We reached the end of the session, and in 4 minutes, I have to go to class.
Next year we have to promise that we're going to Nashville, we're going to have a drink together, the four of us, so we can celebrate our panel this year. All right, so next year.
And I want to thank you all for your participation and your comments. Tony, Charlotte, Mark, I hope we can continue the conversation, and I would welcome your suggestions following this conversation on other or related topics that around which we can cluster a panel or create a panel for next year's ISA, hopefully in person, and then we can go for some drinks. Okay? All right. Thank you all, and thank to our participants. And we can assure you that the Academic Freedom Committee will continue to address these and related aspects. So please stay tuned. Have a nice day, afternoon, evening, whatever time zone you are on, and this to be continued. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, George.
Bye-bye. Thank you again. Thank you.
George. Thank you.
Thank you.